New request from Pakistan. The country wants the U.S. to scale down the drone attacks that have more than doubled since President Obama took office. Tonight, we want to talk about the president's use of military power. He's authorized a campaign in Libya without consulting Congress. Yet in 2007, candidate Obama told the Boston Globe, quote, "The president does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." Close quote. One might argue that Libya does not pose an imminent threat to our nation right now. Joining us with their thoughts on these and similar subjects, Carolyn Heldman, an associate professor of political science at Occidental College, and Nick Gillespie, who is the editor-in-chief of Reason TV and Reason.com, and regular colleagues of mine on the Fox News Channel, the Fox Business Network. Nick, to you first. Is there any dispute but that the president can't start a war on his own when the object of his war has not attacked us, has not threatened us, and isn't even arguably a threat to us?
Right. No, there absolutely isn't. And the only thing good that we can say about this is that it removes every last shred of doubt, or it should, among sentient beings, that Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, are exactly the same when it comes to expansive executive power. They say the same thing when they're out of power. They say the president must be curtailed and constrained, and when they get into power, they look the other way. This is an atrocious but totally expected development in Obama's presidency.
I have a sneaking suspicion that your colleague, though a faculty member at a major university and a self-proclaimed liberal Democrat, Carolyn Heldman, agrees with Nick Gillespie on this one. Am I right?
Absolutely, Judge. I've studied the presidency, and anyone who studies the presidency knows that the Constitution does not authorize a president to go to war. It's only Congress. And the War Powers Resolution of 1973, as you pointed out, only authorizes the president to use force for 60 days if American lives, property, or U.S. soil is being threatened. That's not the case in Libya. I support the president's libertarian, humanitarian efforts to emancipate the rebels, but he has to do it through Congress. And this expansion of presidential power didn't start with him. It started many decades ago,
right.
And I would agree with Nick. This is expected at this point.
Nick, here's what gets me, and Carolyn, you can jump in on this. Feel free to. What really burns me is the Congress looking the other way. I mean, here he waited for Congress to be on spring break. Forgive me, Carolyn. I thought only colleges got spring break, but we know that Congress gets a spring break, too. He waits until he's in Brazil. He thumbs his nose at the Congress by getting permission of the Arab League, which is a bunch of dictators in Cairo, NATO, which is a bunch of social democrats in Belgium, and the pointy heads that run the Security Council of the UN not far from here. Yeah. Why didn't Congress, the week it returned, take to the floor and demand an answer from the president or enact legislation demanding a return of the troops on the plains? Nick Gillespie.
Well, you know, this is actually one of the key problems. I mean, we focus on the executive presidency or the imperial presidency because it's a single person, it's easy to understand, and it's a series of villains going back to, you know, somebody like Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt or George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, you know, who all contravene the Constitution in pursuit of their particular administration's goals. What is galling in the long run is that the Congress, which has the constitutional right and responsibility to declare war, has constantly gone missing in these types of things, where even the authorization of force, you know, in Iraq, you know, how did that, the second time around, how did that pass with more unanimity or near unanimity than the first Persian Gulf War? It's because Congress is filled with a bunch of total lily-livered sapsuckers who, you know, they might say that they belong to the red party or the blue party. It's the yellow stripe down their back that's the real issue here.
All right. When we come back, Carolyn, I'm going to start with you and ask if we have two parties or we just have one party in the government called the War Party. More with our panel after this. At Occidental College, and Nick Gillespie, editor-in-chief of Reason TV and Reason.com. Carolyn, why does it seem that everybody in the government, except for Dennis Kucinich liberals and Ron Paul libertarians, seems to like war?
Well, I think that it's difficult to go against public opinion. I actually place the blame in the hands of the American public. We don't have constitutional literacy, and with the rise of mass media, we have given the president an inordinate amount of power to persuade us. And so I think it's very hard for Congress, which has been called the broken branch, to really stand against the president when he wants to push war measures through.
Nick Gillespie, the other night I asked that question to Charlie Rangel, the famously liberal, somewhat outrageous congressman from Harlem for the past 40 years. And he looked at me and he said, I won't imitate his voice, we like Barack Obama and we like all the other things he's done, so we're going to sort of let him get away with this one, and we can't stand Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, that is not an intellectually sound, legally acceptable, or constitutionally based reason for war.
No, it certainly isn't. And, you know, there's no question that the war fever goes back as far as human history. I mean, people, unfortunately, like war, and governments play to that all the time. I think it's true that we should have constitutional literacy. But, you know, these congressmen are not, they're not cripples. They're not blind. They're not deaf. They're not lead-poisoned children or something. These are people who are paid to uphold the Constitution, and they ought to start doing it, or we ought to start voting more of them out next time around.
Carolyn, do you understand that people will give a president a pass because the target of the military is someone who is so hated as Muammar Gaddafi? Or would it be better that they stuck to the Constitution, lest this become a precedent for a future president to follow?
Well, I think it has become precedent, and that's a problem. And I think that it's a problem anytime you get away from the Constitution. But unfortunately, we do rally around the flag. We give the president carte blanche during times of crisis. And so if he says it's a crisis, then we tend to rally behind him, or hopefully at some point her. And that's a really big problem when it comes to how our country is supposed to function.
It is a really big problem, and I think that every major president in modern times has done this, has expanded the power of the imperial presidency at the expense of the legislative branch. Carolyn Heldman, Nick Gillespie, thank you very much for joining us. My final thoughts on all of this, especially the budget, after this. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Would you hire an employee who claimed he was saving you $38 billion when in reality he was costing you more money than in the previous year of your business, and you still needed to borrow $1 trillion just to stay afloat? You know what's coming tonight. The federal government and your money. Here we go again. I know this sounds ridiculous, but you should not be surprised. Shortly before midnight last Friday, President Obama, House of Representatives Speaker John Boehner, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid announced that the White House and the Congress had reached a stunning deal on cutting the federal government budget by $38 billion. The president grumbled that the cuts were too deep, but he could live with them. Speaker Boehner grumbled that the cuts were not deep enough, but were better than what he originally sought. Senator Reid dispatched his favorite attack dog, that would be the personality-challenged New York Senator Chuck Schumer, to threaten that the Democrats would cut no longer, since the Republicans were controlled by extremists. That's the same Senator Schumer who revealed in a telephone call with reporters that he didn't know was being taped that the Senate Democratic Caucus, which is all of the Senate Democrats, had instructed him to refer to Tea Party Republicans as extremists. The begrudging joint announcement that a government shutdown had been averted came as a surprise at the last minute. And conventional wisdom has it that when you settle a dispute like this and each side is unhappy, you probably did a good job. But there's nothing conventional about this agreement. First, a little background. According to the Constitution and federal law and a 230-year-old tradition, the president proposes a budget sufficiently in advance of the fiscal year in which he wants to spend the money, and the House of Representatives approves, modifies, or disapproves. Then whatever the House has voted on goes to the Senate, then back to the House, then to the president for his signature. The process is supposed to produce a budget months in advance of the fiscal year, so that federal agencies, so that people who sell things to the government, so that the financial community will have time to prepare for what the government will spend. There is currently before the Congress two budget proposals. One is for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th, 2011. And the other is a budget for the fiscal year that begins the next day on October 1st. As you can see, the government is woefully late for the 2011 budget, since we are halfway through that fiscal year. It is for the remainder of this 2011 fiscal year that the so-called deal that cut $38 billion was struck. So, what did they cut $38 billion from? They cut it from what the president wanted to spend, and he wanted to spend far more in 2011 than he did spend in 2010. Thus, even with the so-called cut, spending for the remainder of 2011 will increase, not decrease. As Senator Rand Paul told me on this show last night, only in Washington can a budget that spends more than it did the year before and with a larger deficit be portrayed as cutting. He's right. And the Republicans who boasted that they cut $38 billion and the Democrats who condemned them for doing so are all playing a shell game. America, we are at the precipice of a very deep abyss. It is an enormous hole that needs to be filled with $14.3 trillion. And the president just wants to dig that hole deeper. Since Barack Obama became president, he has increased the debt by $4 trillion. In the next 6 months, he wants to increase the debt by another trillion. And in the 2012 fiscal year, he wants to borrow another $1.7 trillion. America, the White House, and its enablers in Congress are out of control. They have tricked even well-intentioned folks into believing that the economy will collapse if we don't borrow more. That's nonsense. The economy will tank if we do borrow more. It is utterly immoral, illegal, and unconstitutional for the government to borrow when it has neither the intention nor the means to repay the loan. Let me modify that. The government does repay its loans. It just does it with more loans. Would you hire people who run the federal government to run your business or your household or even your checkbook? The answer is obvious. And that leaves another obvious question. Why are these people running the government? Tonight on Freedom Watch at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Fox Business Network, I will go toe-to-toe with Bill Kristol on the president's warmongering in Libya. From New York, my friends, defending freedom. So long, America.